Last week, as I said, we launched into this series that we're calling Heretic, and we were talking about how making great change in the world usually means being willing to offend somebody. And typically, if you're a Christian, it means you probably at some point need to be willing to offend the religious sensibilities of people who like things the way that they are. That every now and then in the church and the history of, the church, but also the history of humanity, there have arisen figures who have dared to say, this thing that is just status quo, this unquestioned assumption and value and practice, actually maybe we need to start questioning it. Maybe there's something about this that actually isn't fundamentally what it means to be a Christian, to be a Jesus follower in the world as we know it. So at some point, you're probably going to have to offend religious sensibilities, but that's a very difficult thing to do, isn't it? It's a difficult thing to live the kind of life that is so committed to truth and is so committed to really following Jesus significantly that you're willing to offend people. My dear old mum used to have a saying, you probably have it over here, if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything at all. That would have really flopped if you don't have that phrase over here. But that's what she used to say. If you don't have anything nice to say, then don't say anything at all. And that works really well when you're raising a child. It works really well until the moment in your life which all of you will fundamentally run into, in which you have to choose to either stand up for what is nice and what is uncontroversial and what is polite, or to stand for what you know and believe to actually be true. You see, being nice works up to a certain point, but at some point in your life, you're going to run into a moment in which you have to make the choice between niceties and status quo and keeping things left unchecked and actually standing for what is true. You see, often what we've done in the church is we've confused being nice with being Christian. And that's why it can often be so difficult for us to dare to believe that we're allowed to offend anybody. But actually, there's a deeper reason that it's difficult. The reason that it's truly difficult for us to live that kind of a life, to stand up for what is true and right when others just stand by, is because none of us want to be seen as something we're not, do we? None of us want to be misinterpreted. None of us want people to carry around a wrong perception of who we are. We don't want to be misunderstood. And tonight what I want us to talk about and wrestle with for the next few minutes is this idea that making change in the world actually begins with a willingness to be misunderstood. So as I said, 500 years ago this month, Martin Luther nailed his letter into the door of the church in Wittenberg, Germany, in which he'd written 95 theses on the corruption that had become of the Catholic Church. Luther was a shining example of what it means to live under no delusion that being Christian means being nice. Luther was a prime, I was going to say something worse there, accidentally swore by accident almost for a second. He wasn't very nice. He was a prime, insert expletive here, not a very nice guy. And so for his troubles in speaking out against the corruption in the church, he was pulled before the Pope himself. And he was invited to recant his position, to explain himself. But Luther was never really interested in explaining himself. And so instead, he responded with the words that would echo through history as some of the most important and famous uttered ever by a Jesus follower in their time. He said, "Here I stand, and I can do no other, so help me God." He said, I can't go against my conscience, that you're asking me to just bow to what is uncontroversial, to leave the status quo unchecked. And Luther said, I can't do that. I have to stand for what is true. And so for his troubles, Luther was made an outlaw. The Pope demanded his arrest. In fact, he went even further. He said, actually, it is a crime to help Luther. If Luther comes to you asking for help, it's a crime to help him. And he went even further than that. And he said, I will promise that anybody who kills Luther, there'll be no legal consequences for that. And so Luther, as you would, ran for his life. And on his way home, he was intercepted in the forest by masked bandits. As I said last week, it's all very Disney. He was intercepted in the forest and taken off to a castle in Wartburg and hidden. So he thought he was being robbed and killed and left for dead. Actually, he was being rescued by some benevolent forces that decided, we want to help this guy, and they hid him in the castle. And he stayed there for the rest of his life and lived out the rest of his life as a heretic, alienated and set apart from the church that he was actually trying to save and trying to help. See, every great change begins as a heresy. Every great change begins with someone who's willing to go against popular opinion, who's willing to stand on the other side of the prevailing view of the way the world is and dare to believe that there's actually something better. Every great change begins as a heresy, or maybe it's more proper and exact to say every great change begins with one person who's willing to be called a heretic. So ask yourself this: what if Luther hadn't been willing to go against popular opinion? What if he had said, actually, I'm the only person who seems to think that the way that we do church now isn't a very good representation of this God of grace? That actually the way that we do church for the rich and powerful and educated and elite, I'm the only person who thinks that that isn't right, that that doesn't represent Christ. What if Luther had started to question himself? Or ask it this way: what if Luther hadn't been willing to be misunderstood? Have you ever been in a moment in which you have to choose to either hold to what you know to be true, but it means accepting a label that you thought you'd never have, or else to compromise, or else to decide just to please the crowd and to bow to popular opinion? There are moments in life in which you have to choose whether you're going to side with truth or with popularity. And great change is always on the other side of that decision. But the question is, why is this so difficult for us? In the early 20th century, sociologists developed a theory that they call the looking glass self, which is basically a way of saying this: your sense of identity, think of the question we just had a few minutes ago, your sense of identity is built on what you think others think about you. Okay? So you use other people as a kind of mirror against which you bounce your own self-perception. So basically, this theory says that none of us are really autonomous and independent of everybody else. We'd like to think that we just breeze through the world quite happy and comfortable with who we are, pretty secure in our personalities. Actually, it's probably more likely that you use other people as a mirror by which you measure yourself, that you become what you think others think that you are. And so, why is it so difficult to break out of that first impression that you make on people? Let me give you an example of this, of the looking glass self theory. Sociologists have found quite recently that if you remind minorities, let's use African Americans, that was who the experiment was done on most recently. If you remind African Americans just before they go into an exam that their culture is burdened under this racist stereotype that African Americans don't do very well on exams. That's a racist stereotype, okay? But it's something that most African Americans have probably picked up at some point in their life. If you remind them just before they go into an exam of that stereotype, they will do less well on the exam than if you didn't remind them of it. Why? Because they pick up this perception and expectation of what it means to be an African American. They use other people, and all of us use the other person as a mirror against which we understand ourselves. And so the reason it's so difficult to break out of the first impression that you make on people is because you actually start to reform your interaction and your character and your personality in order to live up or to live down to what they expect of you, to their perception of you. Now, this theory was originally developed in the early 20th century, which is 100 years before social media. But social media has given whole new vistas to the potential of what it means to measure yourself against how other people think of you. Let me ask you a question. Why is it so hard to look back on old pictures of yourself? I dare you, double dog dare, as an exercise when you leave tonight, to go back to the oldest pictures that you're tagged in on Facebook. And all of you just cringed, like, oh, that just makes me feel sick. Why is that so hard to do? Really think about it. It's just a picture of you when you were younger. So why is it so painful? And if you want a really painful exercise, then go back to my oldest pictures, okay, because I promise they're worse than yours. You can ask my wife. I used to sweep my hair forward so it went across my forehead. And at some point, and it looked pretty bad, at some point when I was, I think, 16 or 17, somebody said, hey, why don't you raise it up and let that forehead breathe? And I tell you, that day changed my life, honestly. That was like my reformation that day. It changed everything. Why is it so painful to go back to old pictures? Well, let me give you a theory. It's because you're now seeing yourself, your younger self, as other people saw you then. You're seeing yourself without the mirror of thinking, hey, maybe this looks good. That actually probably when I wore my hair forward, I don't remember everyone ever telling me that it looked bad. If they had, I would have changed it. But now I look back and realize that they weren't quite being honest about their estimation of me. And so you look back on yourself and you say, did I really think that looked good? You see yourself without the mirror of how other people saw you then. And here's the problem with using other people as a mirror for our own self-perception. The problem is that we become products of other people's judgments. And so what we do is we start to reform ourselves to measure up. We start to make people's perception of us more important than what we think is actually true about us. Have you ever done this? And nowhere is this more destructive than when people associate you with something that you don't want to be associated with. Let me give you an example. I started with a new hairdresser. I don't know why I keep talking about my hair. But I started with a new hairdresser a couple of months ago. And I was talking about why I moved to Calgary to marry my now wife, who was born and raised in Calgary. And he said this, oh, she was raised in Calgary. Is she a Southwest girl or a Northwest girl or a Southeast girl or a Northeast girl? And I thought for a second, that's a really strange question to ask. Why are you asking where she grew up in Calgary? It's so pedestrian. Well, the reason he was asking was because he figured he could tell everything he needed to know about my wife based on whether she was raised in the Southwest, which she was, by the way, so you know her now, or the Northeast, which would be a different kind of person, right? He figured he could make any estimation he needs from that association. You see, we all make these kinds of associations, and they can be really destructive, not only for the person that we're associating something with, but more profoundly for us when people say, oh, you're a ... that means you must be like this. And those associations make it really difficult for us to be ourselves because we're afraid that people will misunderstand us. So let me throw you an association. Think in your head of the first word that comes to mind when I say Christian. We did a little exercise last week in our discussion question as we started this series. What are some of the words that characterize Christianity for people who aren't in the church? People who wouldn't call themselves Christian. Let me ask you this way. Why is it difficult to admit that you're a Christian? Why is it difficult to tell people about your religious belief? If you really think about it, it should be the most ordinary thing in the world. It's just telling somebody that you believe this and you don't believe other things, and yet it's profoundly difficult. Well, maybe it's because calling yourself a Christian means that you know you're at risk of being labeled with associations that you don't want to be associated with. That maybe you're afraid because when you say Christian, what you think somebody hears is right wing. Maybe you tell somebody that you're a Christian, and that would be all well and good unless you thought maybe they think that means you hate gay people. Maybe they think it means you're pro-life, or you're somebody who would associate yourself with the moral majority. A couple of months ago, some pastors in the United States put out something they called the Nashville Statement. And it made a little bit of a controversial mark in church world, but didn't go much further. The Nashville Statement was written by a number of American pastors, some of whom you've probably heard of, most of whom none of us would have heard of. But it was basically a statement that said, hey, as Christians, we don't think it's okay for gay people to marry. Effectively, when you get down to the meat and bones of it, that's what they were saying. Now, that might be controversial to some of us. To others, we might agree with that totally. That doesn't really matter. What matters is that they put out the statement exactly during the time that Texas and Florida were being ravaged by hurricanes. Exactly the time that Christians should have been known for going to places where people's homes had been destroyed and bringing hope and love and joy. Instead, they said to be a Christian means to disagree with homosexuality. See, things like the Nashville Statement make it really difficult for me to call myself a Christian. They make it difficult for me to tell people that I'm a Christian, at least without qualifying what I mean by that. Have you ever done this? Have you ever said to a friend, if they ask you what your religious belief is, yeah, I'm a Christian, but I'm not that. And then just insert word here. I'm a Christian, but I'm not like the kind of Christians that you've met. I'm like a cool Christian, like a young Christian, like a Rob Bell sort of Christian. You know, have you ever done that? The problem is that we measure ourselves against the mirror of what we think others see in us when we call ourselves Christians. And we've all probably had that experience at some point. Which means then that probably the definitive question for our time, is the same question that it was in Martin Luther's time, 500 years ago. The question is this: if to be a Christian no longer means what it's supposed to mean for the world, if the world says this is what it means to be a Christian, and they insert a whole list of misassociations with it, then how do you and I reclaim what it actually means? How do you and I live in a way that shows the world a better way of being a Jesus follower? Well, I think there's worse places to look for an answer to that question than just going to Jesus himself. You see, Jesus lived a life on the other side of constant misunderstanding. He was one of the great mystery figures of all human history, because nobody could ever decide exactly who this guy really was. Sometimes we think of Jesus as a pretty solved case. He came, he was the Messiah, he told people he was the Messiah, and then they killed him for it. Actually, the story's a little bit more complicated than that. He was misunderstood. People were constantly asking, who is this man? And he was constantly refusing to answer them. And the surprise is that Jesus was okay with being misunderstood. That Jesus was actually okay with being thought of as something that he wasn't. So let's read this little bit of scripture in John 7 here. I love this story of Jesus being misunderstood. It says this: after this, Jesus went around in Galilee. He didn't want to go about in Judea because the Jewish leaders there were looking for a way to kill him. But when the Jewish festival of tabernacles was near, Jesus' brothers said to him, "Leave Galilee and go to Judea, so that your disciples there may see the works that you do. No one who wants to become a public figure acts in secret. Since you're doing these things, show yourself to the world," for even his own brothers didn't believe in him. Which the gospel writer seems to think is strange, but if I was the Messiah, I think the last person who would believe it would be my brother. So I don't know why that's such a surprise, but that's okay. Therefore, Jesus told them, "My time is not yet here. For you, any time will do. The world cannot hate you, but it hates me because I testify that its works are evil. You go to the festival. I'm not going up to this festival because my time has not yet fully come." After he said this, he stayed in Galilee. However, after his brothers had left for the festival, he went also, not publicly, but in secret. Now at the festival, the Jewish leaders were watching for Jesus and asking, "Where is he?" Among the crowds, there was widespread whispering about him. Some said, "He's a good man." Others replied, "No, he deceives the people." But no one would say anything publicly about him for fear of the Jews. It's an interesting thing that Jesus says here. The world cannot hate you, the disciples, but it does hate me. The world cannot hate you, but it hates me. Why? Because I testify that its works are evil. Because I don't predicate my life on how I'm perceived like you guys do, but just on doing what is right and true. But the disciples, he says, can never be hated. You see, as long as your primary concern is how you're perceived by others, then you'll probably never really be on the other side of hate. Well, let me put it this way. Most people are just too vanilla to merit hate. And that's probably why we find it so hard to imagine that Jesus was hated, because he was such a nice guy, wasn't he? And yet, actually, we find that Jesus in the scriptures was an incredibly divisive figure, a divisive presence in his time. There's some people say he's a good man, and others say, no, he's a liar. And so the disciples come along and they say, "Jesus, show yourself to the world. Go public. Set the record straight. Tell people who you really are." And maybe we jump to judge the disciples in that. But actually, I think I'd probably have done pretty much the same thing. Because what good is being the Messiah if nobody knows that you're the Messiah? And what good is being a Christian if nobody knows what it truly means to follow Christ? But what's profound is this, that in answer, Jesus doesn't stand on a podium. He doesn't set the record straight. He doesn't put his gloves on to defend himself and his position. Instead, he simply lets the crowds misunderstand who he truly is. You see, he doesn't measure his life against how people perceive him. He doesn't measure his effectiveness and his success against how many people believe in him. He simply lives out of what he knows is true. And he trusts himself to God's time. He says, "My time is not yet here." I think sometimes Christians, we think we're in the business of brand management. That we think, how can anyone ever become a Christian and find Jesus compelling if they don't understand what it means to be a Christian? If they have a warped view of what Christianity itself is. And we start to reshape the gospel away from Jesus and start to move it over to our side. Start to think if we live more irresistibly, then maybe people would join us here. And that's all well and good, but actually, Jesus is a challenge to that. Because Jesus isn't overly concerned about how he's perceived. He's concerned with living as if the gospel is actually true. And if the gospel is true and you live as if it's true, you'll always be a divisive presence. You won't always be the most popular. You won't always be the most liked. People will think things about you that you know aren't true. But the Christian responsibility isn't to manage the world's perception. It's simply to follow Jesus and trust the rest of God. So as we come towards a close here, I want to read this quote. As we start to ask, how do you get past the effect of using other people as a mirror for your own self-perception? Here's a good idea. This is from Steve Bezos, the CEO of Amazon. He says, innovation requires a willingness to be misunderstood. You do something that you genuinely believe in, that you have conviction about, but for a long period of time, well-meaning people may criticize that effort. And when you receive criticism from well-meaning people, it pays to say, first of all, are they right? But if they're not right, if you really have conviction that they're not right, then you need to have a long-term willingness to be misunderstood. That actually, the way that you overcome a life that's predicated on other people's perceptions and the popular opinion is by living for something that is bigger than yourself. Like Jesus. Not living for the way that you're perceived, but living as if the gospel is actually true. You won't be able to make any constructive change in the world as long as you're unwilling for people to misunderstand you. Not just dislike you, not just disagree with you, not just say, actually, that's true for you, but it's not true for me, but actually for people to misunderstand the nature of who you are as a person, to think that you're something you're not. And so how do you get past this looking glass effect? How do you stop using the world as a mirror to measure yourself as a Christian? This is why you need to live for something that's bigger than yourself. You need to build your life around something that is bigger than your own life. You need to know not just what you are or who you are, you need to know why you are. Let me ask the question this way. What is the one definitive problem that you want to solve with your life? Like Luther, taking his theses on the corruption in the church and nailing it into the door of the church in Wittenberg. What is the thing that you need to nail into the door? What is the definitive brokenness in the world that, try as you might, you constantly keep coming back to? The thing that constantly hounds you, that tells you, maybe I'm here for something more than myself. Because unless you know what that is, you'll probably always be at the mercy of other people's opinion. Basing your life around perception, around managing and mitigating the way that people understand you and their opinion of you, is how you accommodate to a life that isn't driven by passion, that isn't driven by something that's bigger than yourself. So listen, as we come to a close, let me close with this quote by Friedrich Nietzsche. He says this: he who has a why to live for can bear almost any how. He who knows what he lives for, he who knows not just what he's doing here, or how he's getting by, or who he is, but knows why he exists, can bear almost anything. You can bear misunderstanding. You can bear misperception. You can bear being labeled something that you're not. You can endure all of it if you know why you're actually here. And so as Christians, we need to consistently ask ourselves this: why are we here? Are we here as brand managers for the gospel, to make sure that the gospel has a fighting chance in the world, that people don't have the wrong perception of what it means to follow Jesus? Are we here to be a walking, talking advertisement for the Jesus life? Or are we here to simply live as if this story is true? To build our lives not around the way people perceive us, but around the purpose that we have in the world? Seems that it means being willing to be misunderstood. To be called something that you aren't is what it means to follow Jesus. To build your life around something that's bigger than your own life. Because if every great change starts as a heresy, if every great change starts with one person who's willing to be called a heretic, and if you truly want to follow Jesus in that way, then you need to reconcile yourself was being misunderstood.